So, we see them on the one hand kind of very much fighting Vikings, but of course we get quite a lot of references as well to, how he used them, how he in a way played one group of Vikings off against another, because of course Vikings weren't this one unified group either, as we have references to different kinds of groups between them. So, absolutely we have a sense that it would have been the same with Flann Sinna.
Welcome to Echoes of History, Máire. It's fantastic to have you with us.
It's very, very nice to be here. Thank you very much, Matt.
I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into this as well. There's loads I don't know about this, so I'm really keen to find out more. I guess to set the scene for us, we're talking about Ireland around about the 9th century. Can you give us a sense of the political structure of Ireland? What did it look like around the 9th century?
Absolutely. Of course, there's a lot we don't know, but I suppose, if we think about the map of Ireland, we can certainly think about kind of, big territorial groupings, like we still know today, in terms of there are references to, I suppose, what we would call provinces. The term in Irish is a fifth, because there's a reference to, Leinster, Munster, Connacht in the west, the Ullad or Ulster in the north. But there's also reference to a place in the middle called Mithe, and the term actually means Mithe. Sometimes people kind of associated with the area kind of around Meath, Westmeath today. But I suppose really what we're talking about in terms of kind of political structures are a large number of kingdoms, dynastically kind of affiliated to one another. We don't know how many kingdoms. I mean, Francis John Byrne about 50 years ago suggested that there might have been about 150 at a slightly earlier period, but it really is impossible to say. But we do have, reference to lots and lots of kingdoms. So in Leinster, for example, there would have been groups like I Cheansealig, I Hónlinge, the Nail or the O'Neills were very, very important in the north of the country. In the south of the country, we have a confederation of groups called the Óghanacha, we have the Ivruin, the Iachrach. So we have, from kind of analytic sources and other types of sources, lots and lots of different names. So we know that there would have been lots of competing groupings. But I say this kind of overarching provincial structure, there is also a kind of a reference to that, and it becomes more important as time progresses.
And do we have any sense of how those kingdoms were ruled, how kings were appointed? Was it hereditary, or was power seized quite often?
I think military might was very, very important. It wasn't officially hereditary, but what's interesting, again, if we look at the historical sources, what's interesting is how often that, a son succeeded a king directly. But I think, what that indicates to us is that the closer you were to the centre of power, the more likely it was that you would be able to succeed, because of course you could take over, the power base of your closest relative. So, military might was undoubtedly very, very important, how you curbed your enemies, but also how you kind of kept control over those closest to you, and particularly, your siblings, or maybe, your cousins who also would have been wanting power. And there were various ways of doing that. So we have references, for example, to, perhaps sending your brother off to become an abbot in a church or whatever. So kind of giving him an important position, but obviously one that took him away from the kind of the centre where he might be kind of attacking you. But also there's an awful lot, as well as military might, there's an awful lot of, political strategy going on. So we have references to kind of different kinds of political strategic alliances at particular times. We also have references to marital alliances that played a really, really important part. Fostering children could also be a way of, if you fostered, or if you sent, one of your children to be fostered with another dynasty, again, that was a way of kind of creating a link between dynasties. So all of these kinds of approaches were, really political kind of maneuvers. But I suppose the other thing to say is that, while the sword was really, really important, the pen was also very important. So again, medieval Ireland was a society that had lots and lots of writing. So in effect, propaganda, king lists, genealogies, writing origin legends after the event, obviously, that kind of, put your own group to the fore. Writing, that was also important. So there were various ways of maintaining power and indeed getting to power in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's always a temptation to view societies everywhere around this time as solely based on military might, but it's a significant piece in the jigsaw, but it's only ever really one piece, isn't it? There is always so much politics going on and as you say, propaganda, myth building, and all of those kinds of things that help maintain a family in power.
And also, I suppose the other thing is, of course, our sources are biased in favour of particular types of evidence. So, for example, chronicles, analytic sources that give us lists of kind of what they would consider to be, the most important kind of events. They talk about the deaths of kings, the deaths of kind of churchmen, and they talk about significant battles. But of course, the kind of, they don't give us the same kind of information about other types of evidence. So sometimes we have to read between the lines to kind of get the nuanced picture.
And so then do we see Ireland over a period of time consolidating those many, many, many kingdoms into sort of slightly larger ones, not dissimilar, I guess, to what's going on in England with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, eventually consolidating into the heptarchy?
Yeah, no, it is very, very, very similar. So even the terminology of kingship kind of gives us some indication of that, because if we go back, a little bit before the 9th century, if we think about 7th and 8th centuries, where we have, a really rich corpus of legal material, and there are references there to a king of a tuath, and a tuath is a particular polity over which a king would rule. But in addition, then we have references to various kings of these tuatha, in the plural, various kings of these tuatha allying and coming together. And there's a term then for a slightly bigger king who was a king of a number of these, and so on and so forth. So I suppose the terminology would give us indication of some kind of hierarchy, and I suppose the existence of some kind of layer of over-kings, but really increased territorial expansion, greater kind of political power, really significant kind of over-kingships that we might think about in terms of provincial kingships. In that context, we have to wait until about the 10th or 11th centuries. So there's certainly a move towards, increasing might, increasing power. But that, of course, would have brought with it, you needed a kind of a greater standing army then, because you needed to kind of control places that were much further away. You probably also needed then a kind of a more complex administration at home, because if you had to go away for longer periods and further away in order to control those places that were much farther from your own kind of locality. Again, so I suppose all of that, all of those changes in terms of the kind of administrative context, in terms of armies and things, that's very, very gradual. So I suppose it's really the kind of the 10th, 11th centuries where we can think about large over-kings, but we're certainly moving in that direction in the 9th century where you're starting here.
Yeah, it's all right being good on the battlefield, but you've got to have a good admin behind you as well.
Keep the home crew in check.
And I guess when we think about Gaelic societies, we quite often think about the idea of clans. Was there a clan structure in Ireland, and how did that sit with the kingships? Was it kind of the same thing as the kingships?
There were certainly dynastic groupings, and of course clan, as you know, is a Gaelic word. It still means kind of offspring, descendants today, and the word was also used for some political groupings. So there's a very famous grouping that Flann Sinna belongs to, Clown, which is the word for clan, Clown Cholmáin. But there were other words used as well. So, for example, the O'Neills, that goes back to a word which means descendant of. There are other kinds of words used again for particular groupings, like Canail, which again means kindred, or Shiel, which is a word for seed. So certainly, again, in this kind of period, the focus does seem to be on kind of dynastic groupings that are related to one another, that come from the same kind of ancestor. And of course, very often those ancestors would have then been built up, often through kind of propaganda and literary texts, into somebody, a glorified ancestor that you really kind of wanted to descend from. But interestingly, when we look at the earlier stage of the language, and when we look at the words there concerned with kind of population groups, they don't seem to focus on that kind of link as much. So one of them, for example, is a type of word that ends in rige, R-A-I-G-E. So Kerry today, for example, down in the southwest of the country, that comes from a term kiorige, so the kind of this collection collective kind of word, and that doesn't seem to have the same kind of affiliation. So what's interesting there is, of course, that the changing terminology does cast light on the nature of the different kind of groupings. But in terms of whether these groupings were the same as kingdoms, well, each of these groupings would of course have had their own king, but then it's how they group together, how they, come together in larger conglomerations. Then the king of that larger group would have been a different one.
You mentioned the name Flann Sinna then, and part of the reason that we're doing this episode in Ireland is that an expansion to Assassin's Creed Valhalla allows players to travel to Ireland in the year 879 to witness the inauguration of Flann Sinna as the new High King of Ireland. What do we know about Flann and his life? Where does he come from? How does he emerge as this High King figure?
Well, I suppose he was born into a very powerful family, and that always helps. His father, a man called Máire, and a very, very powerful king in his own right, and somebody who was called King of Tara. He had died in about 862, and he belonged to this Clan Cholmáin branch of kind of a subgroup of the O'Neills, the southern Ínail. What's interesting, though, is that Flann doesn't seem to have succeeded to his father immediately. So again, what the sources would indicate is there was some kind of power struggle in the 860s. So he certainly didn't have it easy. Again, when we look at king lists, they certainly mention other names. We know that Flann probably had to contend certainly with cousins. So we get a reference to Flann Sinna killing one of his cousins, and then he seems to have kind of come to power after that. So there was something of a kind of a shaky start, and then of course he had to kind of keep control not just over his own branch of the Ínail, so this Clan Cholmáin group, but he also had, of course, to kind of keep control over, or at least keep on side with his nearest neighbours as well. So, we get references, as I say, in sources to some kind of political grappling. We also know that he pursued politically kind of directed, should we say, kind of marital alliances, not just for himself, but also for his children in due course. So, he had a fairly typical career up to 879, the date you mentioned. I suppose the difference, what really happened in 879 that then propelled him to kind of a different dimension, was that in 879, a king called Aed Finlia, and he was of the northern Ínail dynasty. So he was from the other kind of sub-branch of the Ínails, and he was definitely the most powerful O'Neill ruler at the time. And indeed, he was the most powerful ruler in the country at the time. He died, and that, of course, then gave Flann the opening to move into a different kind of sphere.
Yeah, fascinating. So he's sort of potentially murdered his way to power, got to the top of the family, and then he's ended up on the brink of taking this role of High King of Ireland. Can you give us a sense of what the High King was, what it meant to be High King? Are you then effectively in charge of all of Ireland?
No is the simple answer. And I suppose, on some level, we need to kind of problematize the whole concept of high kingship, because it's not a role, it's not an institution, it's not something to which you kind of aspired, or indeed which was then bestowed upon you. And indeed, there are very few references to the term high king. There is a term, high king or great king in contemporary sources, but it doesn't at all seem to indicate, somebody who would then have control over the whole country. It simply didn't work like that. I mean, I suppose really what it is a kind of an aspirational title. If somebody calls themselves Ordri, which is the word for high king, or indeed the synonymous and indeed more frequently used title King of Tara, if somebody called themselves King of Tara, or as I say, Ordri, then in effect, they were proclaiming that they considered themselves to be the most powerful king in Ireland in their day. But that's about as much as it was. And of course, you're only as powerful as your, most recent battle, or, your most recent kind of, propaganda text or whatever. So, it didn't at all convey any kind of, sense of power over the whole country. And indeed, in effect, all of these people who are called either kings of Tara or high kings, what we see them having to do all the time is travel to various places, try to keep control over various groupings. So I think, what it later became, or what we understand under the kind of the concept of high kingship, it's very, very far from the reality.
I love the idea that it's almost like one of those made up job titles that someone's given themselves to try and make them sound more important than they are. You mentioned the Hill of Tara then, or being king of Tara, and I know the Hill of Tara is an important place during this period. Can you just give us a sense of what the Hill of Tara is, where it is, and what it meant to Irish people during this period, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd be delighted to. So Tara is in the Boyne Valley. So it's just this most wonderfully kind of lush, fertile plain, little bit north and west of Dublin, as I say, counties Meath and Westmeath today are really where the kind of the Boyne Valley is. We know that in the prehistoric period, so when we go back much further than the period we're talking about today, we know that in the prehistoric period, it was an important centre. There's lots of archaeological evidence that it was a key place in the prehistoric period. And there's some sense that it was a sacral centre, a kind of a sacred centre, that it was involved, that it was associated with ritual. And when we come to think about it in the 8th and 9th, 10th centuries, I think what we have to imagine is that that kind of earlier association as a kind of a sacred landscape with indeed kind of sacred kingship, that had survived. And I suppose, what our, 9th and 10th century kind of kings are doing is trying to kind of play into that, trying to kind of get some of that notion of that kind of sacrality, as it were, for themselves. So they're very much, by kind of associating themselves with Tara, what they're doing is kind of, I suppose, wanting to link themselves in with the authority that it was perceived that Tara had for a long, long period. So, there's a lot of kind of, ceremonial association with it. So it's certainly not that Tara was a kind of a thriving, vibrant centre of kingship at the time of Flann Sinna, or indeed these other kings. It was associated with kingship. And I suppose this kind of mystique of Tara had, grown up, but actually had also been deliberately cultivated, because of course, if you want to suggest, that your authority, that your kind of sacrality goes back into the dim and distant past, then you write stories and you give an account of Tara that kind of highlights its kind of association with kingship. So in a way, just going there, I think, if we go there today, I think we have to think that, people in the 9th century would have had a kind of a similar kind of experience. It's a hugely atmospheric place. As I say, it's a hill. So it, looks out, it has this most incredible view. So you can immediately imagine why it would have been a place of strategic importance at one point. But as I say, we're talking about the prehistoric period. There is evidence so there are archaeological excavations have shown, indeed, you can see some kind of structures on the ground, but you don't get a sense, I think, of, the once bustling kind of centre it would have been in the prehistoric period, but that would have been true for 9th century contemporaries as well. So it was much more the kind of the ceremonial nature of it, I think, that would have been important in the times, say, of Flann Sinna.
Yeah, I've had the absolute pleasure of going to the Hill of Tara. It's an incredible location to visit. I think the fact that I heard was on a clear day, you can see something like 2/3 of the landmass of the island of Ireland from the top of the Hill of Tara. You can see just so far. It is an incredible experience to be there. And you get the impression that it's one of those places where people would feel this connection to ancestry, to the past. So, it's not that it's some massive castle, it's not that it's some huge seat of power, but it's this connection to everything that has gone before, the kind of the memories that linger in that landscape are what's really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is, hugely, it's a hugely moving place, actually, when you go there, as you've absolutely rightly articulated, but not in the sense of kind of, big buildings or the like. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, and there is the Irish Stone of Destiny there too. Would that have been there at the time of Flann Sinna too?
Again, in effect, that's something that's kind of, very much constructed in, literary texts as this kind of stone that, spoke when the rightful king approached it. But again, that's very much part of this focus on authority, again, another sign or symbol, reassuring people, as it were, in various different ways that they've chosen wisely, or indeed that the person who's imposed themselves upon them as king isn't so bad. But again, these are literary tropes. They're kind of, symbols. They have a kind of a function in the kind of the literature of kingship, in the paraphernalia of kingship. But whether it was there or not, we simply can't say. The reference to the stone is kind of so prevalent in quite a lot of texts and kind of appears in different ways, and the stone kind of moving apart to let the rightful king, to go through it. But these are all, that's associated with kings, obviously, in the dim and distant past.
For what it's worth, I tried most of those things, and it turns out I'm definitely not the High King of Ireland, so never mind. It was worth a go. And are there other aspects or elements or places connected to the idea of High Kingship too?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, in that same kind of landscape, not actually too far from Tara, and you may indeed have visited as well when you were there, is a place called Telltown, Telltu in Irish. And there's a reference in these contemporary sources in the 9th and 10th century. There are references to rituals. So there's a reference to a feis, or a feast, literally a kind of a celebration of Tara. But there's also a reference to Animus, or a kind of a gathering at Telltown. And these two places then would have been very, very significant places of ritual associated with the kingship of Tara. And, again, if we go back to Flann Sinna, that your listeners might be interested in, we have reference to Flann Sinna holding this Animus Telltown, this kind of gathering of Telltown. And what seems to have been involved there is it was kind of like, a powerful king gathering all of his subjects kind of together. And again, we have some references in various texts that kind of give us an indication of the kinds of things that might have gone on there. Certainly political decisions might have been taken. There might have been kind of argy-bargy in terms of laws. There would have been a lot of kind of social interaction, trading, music, that kind of thing. So it seems to have been a public kind of communal gathering. And of course, the way it's presented in the sources is that by holding the gathering of Telltu, as it were, or the Feast of Tara, a king was showing his kind of power and was, in effect, proving that he was the rightful king because he could gather together these people. And what's interesting is, Flann Sinna, we know there's reference to him holding this gathering, but his predecessor, Finlia, in some of the chronicles, we get kind of murmurings of complaint. I hope I'm not kind of exaggerating there, but at least kind of murmurings that he should have been holding this gathering and he wasn't. So, it had kind of ritualistic significance, but it was also a kind of a practical thing. And kings needed to associate themselves with these occasions, with these celebrations, again, that are presented as going back into the dim and distant past. So again, by holding them, then a king would have been kind of associating himself with kind of glorious predecessors and, in a way, showing that he too had this kind of authority. So those are the two that are most frequently mentioned in this period, this Animus, this gathering of Telltown, and the Feast of Tara.
Fascinating. And so for Flann Sinna, for example, having had himself inaugurated as High King of Ireland, what does that actually mean for his role? How much power does he really have, and what do people expect from him in that position?
I suppose even the whole concept of inauguration is a kind of is a difficult one. I mean, he certainly, as I say, took power upon himself, but was, really a very good kind of political strategist. I mean, people would certainly have assumed that he took care of them, as it were, in a kind of a more general sense. I mean, that there was a kind of an ideology of kingship in that, in the literary text, the kind of the tropes that are highlighted again and again is that if the rightful king is ruling, then basically, everything is incredibly fertile and, wheat grows and, there's masses of honey and the cows give as much milk as you could possibly want. So there is this very kind of close association between good kingship and the fertility of the land. That's a literary trope. But of course, we can assume that what lies behind it is that people expected that if their king was doing the right thing, that would be reflected in their everyday lives, that there would be kind of plenty. So we can, assume that what people would want of a powerful king is for their lives to be, comfortable, regulated, all that. Of course, the reality is that even kings as powerful as Flann Sinna had to, make sure that they retained their power. I mean, towards the end of Flann Sinna's life, for example, we get reference to him having to contend with some of his sons, so I suppose we're getting restless for their own kind of turn at it. So again, while he might have wanted to kind of, he succeeded as the most powerful king in the country when Finliath died, but that wasn't the end of the matter. He couldn't just rest on his laurels then. He, kept having to kind of come back, make sure that, various groups were kept in check and the like.
Sounds like he had a pretty rough time from his own family, which seems like a trope in kingship, doesn't it? The sons are always the biggest problem. Do we have a sense then of whether Flann Sinna was a good High King? Is he remembered as a good High King, a strong High King?
I think the very fact that we have a reasonable amount of information concerning him would suggest that, yes, I mean, he inherited power. He also then kind of passed on power, and he was part of, a really very, very authoritative dynasty. So yes, I think he would be seen as somebody who, played his part in the lore of that particular dynasty, as somebody who was authoritative and in control. Clearly he had his setbacks, but I think he would have been, he wasn't unusual, but he would have been seen as somebody who was relatively powerful. And, they didn't try to disown him when they kind of, went on. Indeed, quite the contrary. Sometimes he was kind of, exalted.
And was there any particular religious significance to the position of the High King too? So, Ireland famously referred to frequently as the land of saints and scholars. St. Patrick has brought Christianity over there a few centuries earlier. And this is a church that grows up sort of separate to the Roman traditions. Does the High King have a role to play in the religious life of Ireland?
I suppose the starting point is that there's a very, very close connection between secular and ecclesiastical power. There's no doubt but that kings used the church, for their own kind of political ends. But of course, the church got a lot out of kings as well. I mean, even the very kind of land that monasteries were kind of built on or whatever, would have been bestowed by particular kings. So I think in kind of modern times, we think very much of a kind of a clear division between kind of church and state. But as you know, that wasn't the case at all. They were very much interconnected. I think in terms of, being the most powerful king in Ireland, I think what's interesting in that regard is that really, really powerful kings often aligned themselves with the Church of Armagh, because of course the Church of Armagh, which was of course Patrick's church, the Church of Armagh very, very early established itself as something of a kind of a Church of all Ireland. I mean, Patrick, as he's constructed by his kind of later biographers, I should say, was meant to kind of, go around the country and, in effect, link various churches together. So I suppose if Armagh had at least this kind of aura of being an all-Ireland church, one can imagine that kind of very powerful kings, by linking themselves to Armagh, then they wanted to kind of, at least give the impression that they too might have been kings across the country. I mean, Flann Sinna and the O'Neills, of course, they were very close to Armagh, was, in their territorial kind of patch, as it were. But we see that happening with Munster kings as well. So, for example, Brian Boru, in the 10th century, he died in the early 11th. He's somebody who's, his own kind of territorial patch is very, very far south. He's a Munster king, but he aligns himself with Armagh. And again, the reason is that he absolutely, wants to be perceived as the most powerful king in Ireland in his day. So we can very much see kings and ecclesiastics and powerful ecclesiastics kind of working hand in hand. But in terms of kind of, religious significance, or indeed in terms of real piety, it's very, very hard to see if that ever came into it. I mean, what we actually get a sense of is the kind of the political use of the church. Interestingly, actually, now that I think about it, Finlia, he has, for some reason, a reputation for piety, again, because of a couple of things, a couple of kind of nuances in various analytic kind of sources. And actually, a later writer said of him that he had said that, battles weren't won through kind of, the power of warriors, but actually it was God deciding whether battles should be won or not. So, but that's a very unusual kind of sentiment. And as I say, it was ascribed to him much, much later. So we don't get a real sense of, what they actually thought, but we do get a sense of how these kings used the church for their own kind of political ends.
From an Assassin's Creed Valhalla point of view, we're partly in Ireland in connection with the Norse presence there. What did the arrival of Norse people mean for the Irish? I mean, there's the element that the Norse were pagans whilst the Irish were Christians. The game seems to present Flann Sinna as High King having a pretty good relationship with the Vikings. Do we know how the two groups got on?
Yeah, no, I think obviously, again, it changed over time. I mean, when Vikings came at the very end of the 8th century, I mean, the first couple of decades, we have a lot of references to short, sharp attacks. I mean, obviously they wouldn't have been considered such by the people who were suffering these attacks, but we have, a sense of kind of Vikings coming, attacking, going. We have a lot of references to raids on coastal centres, but quite early. So, they came around 795. Already in the 830s, we have references to alliances being made and Vikings becoming more and more part of, the kind of the shifting political allegiances of the medieval Irish kind of political scene. We know that they overwintered, for example, in Dublin in 840, 841. So as soon, of course, as they started being more of a kind of a permanent presence on the scene, they would have, of course, been incorporated into the kind of the political shenanigans, as it were, at the time. And we have lots and lots of references to, kings, contemporaries of Flann Sinna, and indeed earlier kings who allied with and fought against Vikings in turn. So, we see them being incorporated into the kind of the Irish political scene. I mean, again, a contemporary of Flann Sinna, a man called Cerival, who's from Leinster. We have quite a lot of information about his relations with Vikings, mainly because of a later text called the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland, which sets him up as, on the one hand, kind of very much fighting Vikings, but of course we get quite a lot of references as well to, how he used them, how he, in a way, played one group of Vikings off against another, because of course Vikings weren't this one unified group either. As we have references to different kinds of groups between them. So absolutely we have a sense that it would have been the same with Flann Sinna. He too had recourse to Scandinavian help when he needed it and would have, fought against them in turn. But as I say, they became very much part and parcel of the Irish political scene, and that's how we see them referred to in sources.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking how the Vikings will kind of settle and become part of the fabric of Ireland during this period. Do we have a sense of the kind of the cultural impact that the Norse people have on Ireland at this time?
It was quite significant. I mean, I suppose we have to assume that, of course, Norse was spoken and indeed written in significant parts of Ireland for a considerable period, particularly when, there were groups of settlers, say in Dublin and Limerick and these kinds of various places. And, we have to assume that they would have continued to compose their own kind of literature. But interestingly as well, we get references again quite early on to Vikings being referred to in medieval Irish literary sources. So there is a relatively well-known poet who writes quite a lot of kind of historical political poetry. His name is Cynnéad Ó Hartagáin from the 10th century, and one of his poems has survived to Olafur Aulív, King of Dublin. And he says at the end of his poem that he got a gift in return for writing this poem from the King of Dublin. We know that same king, and indeed others, were patronising churches. Back to your earlier question about kind of religious significance, again, these Viking kings were behaving like kind of Irish kings as well. So again, a bit like they were doing kind of in political circles, we see them being incorporated into the cultural and social life as well. And as I say, we have references to Hiberno-Norse kings of Dublin, because I suppose by then they would have had a kind of this hybrid identity, whatever we want to see behind it. But these Hiberno-Norse kings of Dublin were also being kind of celebrated, written about in vernacular Irish material. So, so that too, of course, had cultural significance. I suppose it also had, one of the other ways that they may have been significant in this regard is, particularly in the early period, I suppose identity is relational. So if you encounter a different group, then you begin to, you kind of assess yourself as a group in relation to another group. So certainly I think there would have been some influence on how various groups of Irish kind of thought about themselves. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's precisely in the 9th century, when we have Vikings coming in, that we also get for the first time in annalistic sources a reference to a king of Ireland, Rí Éireann. So we've been talking about kingship of Tara, the more kind of vague High King, but we do get references to a king of Ireland. And again, you can imagine that, just there's a slight kind of redefining or rethinking of who you are, what your kind of boundaries are if you encounter another group or indeed different groups.
Because I know Dublin and lots of those other kind of cities, particularly on the east coast of Ireland, trace their emergence back to the Vikings. So the Vikings established lots of those cities, and I don't get a sense there was so many towns and big areas, big settlements like that in Ireland before the Vikings come. So they almost bring urbanization to Ireland too.
Yeah, that's certainly an argument that's been made. I mean, there were communities, as it were. There were centres, there were trading centres, ecclesiastical centres that would have, had all kinds of things going on. But certainly in terms of centres that were outward looking, that traded beyond Ireland, I mean, there was some of that, but larger centres came into being certainly under Viking influence. It's difficult to say what developments might have happened had they not come. I mean, that's the kind of the what if of history, as it were.
And just to take us back to Flann Sinna before we close, what happens to him in the end? How long is he High King? Is he succeeded by one of his sons?
Yeah, no, and he dies in 916, and we know certainly that towards the end of his life there was quite a lot of dynastic strife, I suppose you might call it. I mean, in about a decade or so before he died in 904, his son, a man called Don, revolted against him. So clearly the younger generation really absolutely were kind of were standing in the wings. Actually, it wasn't that person. It wasn't Donachad who immediately succeeded Flann. It was actually another son of his, Conchobar, who had worked alongside Donachad. But he actually died in a big battle, the Battle of Dublin, in 919. So he didn't follow Flann for too long. And then eventually Donachad did come to the throne and reigned for, another 20, 25 years. So yes, the lineage continued.
And when does the position of High King of Ireland, whatever that really meant, when does the position of High King of Ireland finally disappear?
I suppose in a way I'd put the question the other way. I'd kind of say, when does it become almost a kind of an institution? That's putting it a little bit too strongly, because on some level it's when, with the English invasion in 1169, they come in. And one of the ways that the most powerful king of Ireland at the time is perceived, namely O'Connor from Connacht, is to them as High King. So he's always presented from then on, and indeed his successors are presented as High Kings. But of course, by then, the English had colonized part of the country. So by then, on some level, when we have increasing number of references to it, that's precisely the time when, of course, it's less meaningful. So I suppose in the 12th century, it just so happens that we have a number of kings from Connacht, from the north of the country, from Munster, and indeed from a place called Breffna between the north and the west. We have a number of kings who reigned for a very, very long time. So we can see them, we can kind of follow their political careers for a significant length of time. And we see them very much kind of jostling and indeed wanting to be most powerful king of Ireland. So there, I think, one might imagine that what they want is to kind of become, what they might then be thinking of as High King. But because I suppose it's so vague, I don't think we can really, talk about it then suddenly dying or disappearing. Sorry, that's not probably a very good answer to what you've asked, but it's a really, really complex concept.
I think the fact that it becomes more institutionalized, perhaps with the arrival of the Anglo-Normans, is interesting, because I guess from their point of view, they probably want one enemy that they can fight and focus on. What they don't want is to have to fight 4, 5, 6 different kings, lots of different clans potentially. They want one figure they can negotiate with, focus on and conquer. So it suits them to institutionalize this notion of a High King more than it ever has been in Ireland before.
Absolutely, yeah. No, absolutely.
And just to end on, I like to ask all my guests this. The idea of Assassin's Creed is that we can put you into an Animus and you can travel back in time and you can witness all of these events playing out. If I could put you into an Animus and assure your safety, you're in no danger, no physical danger whatsoever, is there a moment perhaps in the life of Flann Sinna or a moment in the roles of the High King of Ireland that you would like to go back and witness?
I suppose in the case of Flann Sinna, I'd very much like to be put back to observe his daughter, a woman called Gormla, who's actually a kind of a very interesting woman in her own right, and one of the women that we, have at least a glimpse of. And she was, of course, also kind of married off, but she does seem to have some kind of agency, to use that kind of word herself. And I'd like to be a fly on the wall and see, how her kind of dealings with her father might have played out and what she would have thought of, in a way being kind of, a pawn, a political pawn, but also what she might have made of it all. So I'd like to be Gormla for a day.
I guess I think I'd really like to go back to a point on the Hill of Tara when it's being used for its ceremonial purposes and to get a real sense of that atmosphere there. But I think it's probably just because I've been there and I found it quite an evocative space, and to be there when it's being used at the height of its prominence for what it was designed for, I think would be incredible.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, no. I mean, if we have this, it's so atmospheric today when it's kind of, empty, even if you're there on a kind of a, grey October day like today is, yeah, you're absolutely right. To kind of see it in a different context would be very illuminating.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Máire. It's been great to try and get a bit closer to the idea of the High King of Ireland, to understand what it was, what it meant, what these people did, what it took to get there, and to explore the life of Flann Sinna a bit more. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. You should also hit the links that are floating on the screen somewhere. Are they on my face?